Across deserts, jungles, and coastlines there are places where entire peoples once thrived, cities built from stone, languages sung to the stars, and rituals that tied sky, earth, and ocean into a single story. Then, almost without warning, they were gone. What force can erase not just villages, but whole civilizations, leaving behind only silent ruins and puzzling artifacts? Was it the earth shifting beneath their feet, the climate turning against them, invading armies, or something hidden within their own myths? This journey is an exploration of vanished civilizations, societies that flourished for centuries and then seemed to disappear overnight. As we travel through these stories, you will hear not just the chronicles of archaeologists, but also the whispers of legends, prophecies, sacred numbers, and symbols etched into stone that later cultures still echo. Nothing here is presented as certain doom or mystery for its own sake. Each account is framed by what scholars know, and by what oral traditions tell us, so that you can sense the living people behind the ruins, their hopes, fears, and innovations. We begin not with a single lost city, but with the idea of disappearance itself. In history, cultures rarely vanish like a switch being turned off. Instead, they migrate, merge, or transform until their original identity fades. Yet some cases are so abrupt that to later observers it feels like an overnight erasure. The term lost civilization became popular in the 19th century when explorers encountered monumental architecture in regions thought to be empty. Today, archaeologists prefer to speak of abandoned centers or collapsed systems, but the mystery remains compelling because it touches a universal fear that our own world could also fade. Imagine walking across a windswept plateau where rows of stone houses stretch toward a cliff edge. There's no sign of fire or battle. The pottery is still on the floors, tools neatly stored. It looks as if the inhabitants simply stood up and left. This is the image visitors get at certain ancestral Puebloan sites in the American Southwest. Or picture a vast complex of raised fields and canals in the Amazon rainforest revealed only by aerial lidar scanning, evidence of an organized society that European chroniclers barely glimpsed before disease and conquest decimated it. These are not isolated curiosities. They are part of a global pattern of rise, adaptation, and sometimes disappearance. To approach these vanished worlds, we will weave together three kinds of strands. First, the historical and archaeological data, carbon dating, pollen analysis, inscriptions, and trade routes. Second, the myths and oral traditions that still circulate among descendant communities. Third, the modern echoes, festivals, place names, and even popular culture that revives these stories in new forms. By moving between these strands, you'll see how disappearance is rarely total. Fragments survive, carried in songs, words, and ideas long after temples crumble. Our opening lens focuses on the psychological impact of ruins themselves. When early travelers in the 1800s stumbled upon Maya temples overgrown with jungle, they often described them as cities swallowed overnight by nature. This imagery of sudden swallowing persisted even though the actual process was gradual. Yet legends often speak of instant vanishings, islands sinking beneath waves in a single day, or towns cursed to sleep beneath hills until a hero returns. These stories are not just entertainment. They are cultural metaphors for change, exile, and memory. In this series of stories, you will hear about islands, plateaus, valleys, and river mouths where disappearance took dramatic forms. Some places lost their populations through drought or trade disruption. Others were struck by conquest, but then mythologized as if the earth itself removed them. A few were never lost at all but hidden by our assumptions until new technology revealed them. Throughout, you will be invited to imagine not only what happened but why the legend of sudden vanishing endures. Consider for a moment the city of Tiwanaku in central Mexico. By the time the Aztec Empire rose, this immense urban center, with its Avenue of the Dead and the pyramids of the sun and moon, had already been abandoned for centuries. The Aztecs named it the place where the gods were created because they sensed something sacred about its emptiness. No one today knows the original name of its builders. Here, vanishing overnight was not literal, but the mystery of who they were and why they left became fertile ground for legend. This pattern will recur as we move from continent to continent. In each case, we'll pay attention to symbols, animals carved on pillars, sequences of numbers, astronomical alignments. These are more than decoration. They encode calendars, migrations, and cosmologies that can hint at why people chose or were forced to abandon their homes. For example, when drought cycles match ritual calendars, a society might interpret environmental stress as spiritual displeasure, leading to mass relocation or a radical change in leadership. In our modern terms, it's climate and governance. In theirs, it's omens and destiny. We will also meet the living voices connected to these sites. Many indigenous communities maintain oral histories that outsiders once dismissed as myth, but which later proved to contain accurate details about landscape changes, floods, or ancestral journeys. Listening to those voices not only humanizes the vanished, but also reframes disappearance as transformation. Cultures do not simply stop. They flow into others, reshaping languages, crafts, and beliefs in ways that may still influence us. Finally, this opening section asks you to hold two ideas at once. On the one hand, mystery, the genuine gaps in our knowledge, the ruins without inscriptions, the layers of soil hiding forgotten streets. On the other, continuity, the fact that every vanished civilization leaves traces, whether in DNA, loanwords, or a festival that still lights fires on a solstice. This tension between mystery and continuity is what gives the theme its power. As we proceed, we'll journey from windswept Scottish islands to the rainforests of South America, from sunken Mediterranean ports to high-altitude fortresses in the Himalayas. Each place will offer its own version of the vanished overnight story, and each will invite you to question what really happened, how legends preserved it, and why it still resonates. This is not a catalog of doom, but a portrait of human adaptability, imagination, and memory. By the end, you may see your own city differently, as a layer in a long continuum of building, flourishing, and sometimes leaving. The ruins are not just about the past. They are mirrors for our present choices. To understand why whole cultures seem to vanish, we first need to step inside their worlds, not as outsiders cataloging ruins, but as guests. Geography, climate, trade networks, and spiritual outlook shaped every choice these societies made. Without that context, their disappearance looks abrupt. With it, you can see long arcs of resilience and change that later observers compress into a single moment of loss. Picture the globe between 2000 BCE and 1500 CE. Populations were not static dots on a map, but tides of movement. Farmers clearing new fields, sailors pushing farther along coasts, traders linking deserts to mountains. Rivers flooded and receded on schedules that determined harvests. Volcanic eruptions darkened skies half a world away. In this shifting environment, urban centers were both achievements and vulnerabilities. The bigger and more interconnected a city became, the more it depended on fragile systems of food, water, and legitimacy. Take the Indus Valley Civilization. For centuries it stretched across what is now Pakistan and northwest India, with grid-planned cities, standardized weights, and a script still undeciphered. Around 1900 BCE, many of its great urban centers thinned out. Archaeologists see gradual shifts, changing river courses, trade disruptions. Yet later legends speak of sudden abandonments and divine displeasure. When British explorers first mapped these mounds, they imagined a lost race. Today we know the people didn't disappear, but moved eastward into smaller settlements, carrying skills that shaped later cultures. The overnight was really a long-term adaptation retold as myth. On the other side of the planet, the people who built the great stone houses of the Orkney Islands in Scotland lived in a maritime world of fishing, farming, and ritual. Sites such as Skara show rooms still fitted with stone beds and shelves. Storms and erosion have revealed them dramatically, making it feel as though time opened a window on a frozen day. In reality, climate cooling and shifting social networks gradually reduced the population. Yet local folklore tells of a community swept away by a single catastrophic storm. That story became part of island identity, passed down in tales of hidden villages under the dunes. Moving southward, along the Andean highlands, we find cultures that built terraced fields and monumental stonework long before the Inca. At places like Tiwanaku near Lake Titicaca, complex drainage and astronomical alignments hint at deep environmental knowledge. Around 1000 CE, the system faltered, possibly through drought linked to El Niño cycles, and people dispersed. Oral traditions of the Aymara still speak of ancestral centers, turned to stone, or sleeping beneath the earth, metaphors for both ruin and sacredness. Archaeologists confirm climate stress, but also see political fragmentation. Again, the legend of sudden stillness overlays a process of decades. The theme repeats in North America's southwest. Chaco Canyon's great houses and ceremonial roads were built between the 9th and 12th centuries. By the 1300s, large portions of the region were abandoned. Triering data show severe droughts. Evidence of social strain appears in the archaeological record. Yet among Pueblo peoples today, there are stories of migrations, guided by spiritual instructions, leaving at a preordained time to fulfill a larger cycle. Where outsiders saw collapse, descendants speak of purposeful movement. Even islands in the Pacific tell similar tales. Rapa Nui, Easter Island, is often portrayed as a cautionary fable of self-destruction. Popular books once claimed its people cut down every tree and then descended into chaos. New research paints a more complex picture of resilience under stress, with European contact and disease playing major roles in demographic decline. Local oral history remembers heroic ancestors, voyaging canoes, and the Moai statues as living presences, not markers of collapse. Vanished overnight. Here was a colonial narrative imposed on a society that endured. Why do these myths of instant disappearance persist? Partly because abruptness is dramatic. A city gradually emptying over 50 years feels mundane. A city swallowed by the sea in a night becomes legend. Partly because oral traditions compress time for memory's sake. And partly because later cultures, arriving at ruins whose builders they no longer know, project their own fears or moral lessons onto them, warnings about hubris, divine punishment, or impermanence. This is why context matters. Each lost civilization sat within networks of climate, trade, and belief. Remove one strand and the whole pattern might shift. A river changes course and fields dry. A key trade partner collapses and elites lose legitimacy. An ideology loses its unifying force and people disperse. These processes can be slow but still traumatic, leaving material traces that later generations interpret as signs of a sudden, mysterious end. To feel that context more vividly, imagine traveling as an ordinary person within one of these societies. In a bustling Indus city, you'd smell baked brick and hear the splash of water from wells. In Chaco Canyon, you'd see long processional roads converging on a great kiva, pilgrims arriving from distant communities. In Tiwanaku, you'd watch priests mark solstices at the Kalasasaya temple as farmers prepare terraces fed by raised field canals. Life would feel stable, even sacredly ordered, until drought deepens, trade falters, or new ideas spread, prompting families to leave. From a future vantage point, it looks like disappearance. From the inside, it feels like migration, adaptation, or transformation. Geography also shaped how ruins survived. In tropical climates, stonework vanishes under vegetation. In deserts, it stands starkly exposed. This affects how later explorers discover sites and narrate their stories. Maya temples buried in jungle seemed like a hidden world swallowed whole. Puebloan cliff dwellings exposed to dry air looked like households abandoned mid-meal. The same underlying process, gradual change, can thus appear either sudden or invisible depending on landscape. All of this leads to a broader truth about vanished civilizations. The line between myth and memory is porous. Oral traditions often encode environmental events such as floods, volcanic eruptions, or migrations. These memories may survive thousands of years with symbolic embellishment. When modern science corroborates them, as with certain Australian Aboriginal stories of sea level rise after the last ice age, we see how myth can preserve data. Conversely, when there is no corroboration, myths still reveal cultural values and fears. They are part of the record, just as pottery shards are. In the next segments of our journey, we will step deeper into origin stories and characters, the gods, heroes, and symbols that shaped how each society understood itself. By doing So we will not only encounter dramatic tales of disappearance, but also see how those tales offered meaning to the people living them and to their descendants. When you hear the phrase lost civilization, images spring up of crumbling temples, hidden chambers, and silent statues. Yet behind each ruin there were storytellers. Every society carried within it not only laws and crafts, but also explanations for its own beginnings and possible endings. These explanations, legends, prophecies, ritual dramas, outlasted the physical walls, becoming the first clues for outsiders trying to understand who built what and why. Ancient stories rarely present themselves as history. They emerge as chants, songs, or mythic genealogies, repeated until they feel timeless. They do not separate natural forces from supernatural will. A drought can be the anger of a deity, an earthquake, a sleeping serpent turning beneath the land. When an archaeologist reads a layer of ash, she calls it a volcanic event. When an oral historian listens to a local elder, he hears about a mountain spirit striking back. Neither view is necessarily false. One describes mechanism, the other meaning. Consider the Indus Valley again. Its undeciphered script prevents us from reading any text directly, but seals show horned figures seated in yogic postures, animals arrayed in rows, and mysterious standards. Some scholars see early forms of deities later named in Hindu traditions. Others caution against projecting. What is clear is that these symbols were part of a worldview where order and abundance were connected to cosmic balance. If rivers shifted and cities were abandoned, people may have seen it not only as a practical crisis, but as a sign that rituals had lost their power. On the islands of Orkney, Neolithic stone circles, like the Ring of Brodger, and ritual complexes, like Ness of Brodger, appear to have been gathering places for communities spread across the archipelago. Local legends tell of dancing giants turned to stone at sunrise, of hidden villages sleeping under the hills. Such tales mirror a pattern seen worldwide. When a place once full of life becomes empty, later generations explain it with transformation or enchantment. The people did not just leave. They became part of the landscape. Across the Atlantic, among the ancestral Puebloans, migration stories are central. Even today, Pueblo elders recount how their ancestors emerged from an underworld, traveled through sacred stops, and were guided to their present homes. These narratives include episodes of leaving great centers when the time was right, instructed by spiritual signs. For outside researchers, abandonment looks like collapse. For descendants, it is fulfillment of a cycle foretold since origin times. High in the Andes, Tiwanaku's monumental gates and carved faces watch the horizon. The Aymara language preserves words for ancient builders and spirits that once animated the stones. Oral traditions speak of cities frozen or turned to stone after their inhabitants broke taboos. These are not simply cautionary tales. They encode memory of droughts, political upheavals, and mass relocations. By framing them as myth, communities integrated loss into a sacred narrative, turning trauma into destiny. Even the most famous of all vanished worlds, Atlantis, comes to us not from archaeology, but from literature. Plato's dialogues recount a powerful island civilization that sank beneath the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars debate whether he drew from older Egyptian stories, invented an allegory, or synthesized several traditions. Whatever its origin, the tale set a template for how later cultures imagined disappearance. Sudden, cataclysmic, moralized. Real floods and earthquakes were woven into the pattern, but the story's endurance lies in its symbolic clarity. It is the ultimate vanished overnight myth. We also see this in smaller-scale legends. In Brittany there is the story of Ys, a city swallowed by the ocean due to a princess's transgression. In Mesoamerica, myths of cities consumed by the earth after priests erred. In Southeast Asia, tales of kingdoms turned to stone when kings broke sacred oaths. These narratives provide moral structure to history. They say, societies fall not randomly, but because they lost balance with cosmic law. For communities facing environmental or political stress, such stories help make sense of uncertainty. Modern archaeology has begun to respect these oral traditions not as curiosities, but as data. In Australia, dozens of Aboriginal groups tell of coastlines now submerged, describing features that match today's underwater topography. These memories reach back more than 7,000 years to post-glacial sea level rise. In North America, stories of great floods align with evidence of glacial lake outbursts. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous accounts of a mountain's top blowing off correspond with Mount St. Helens' prehistoric eruptions. Myth, in these cases, is not mere fantasy but long-term record-keeping. At the same time, myths evolve. A story of migration may turn into a story of punishment when told by outsiders or used as a moral warning. A voluntary relocation becomes a divine curse. This is why vanished civilizations appear more mysterious the farther we are from their own voices. Without access to original languages, symbols, and contexts, we project our fears and fascinations onto them. That is why every generation rediscovers lost cities with a slightly different narrative: romantic, tragic, ecological, or extraterrestrial. Yet within this complexity, one truth stands out. No culture imagined itself simply ceasing. Every tradition contains cycles: creation, flourishing, decline, renewal. In Mesoamerican calendars, ages end with catastrophe, but another sun rises. In Hindu cosmology, yugas roll forward in immense epochs. In Norse myth, Ragnarok destroys the gods, but a new world emerges. Even in Plato's Atlantis story, survivors populate other lands. These cycles provided resilience. When crisis came, people could interpret leaving as part of a larger design, rather than pure collapse. This origin layer matters for our exploration because it colors every ruin we will visit. When you walk through an abandoned ceremonial plaza, you're not just seeing economic failure or climate stress. You're stepping into a worldview where departure, transformation, and even vanishing may have been anticipated. Understanding that helps us read the stones differently, with less of our own apocalyptic imagination and more of their cyclical one. In the coming sections, we will look at key characters, gods, heroes, and culture bearers who embody these cycles. They are not only protagonists of myths, but also archetypes through which communities negotiated change. By tracing them, we see how legends of disappearance are really legends of continuity, encoded in narrative form. Every vanished world carried a pantheon of names and figures that its people used to understand their place in the cosmos. These beings were not just subjects of worship, they were maps of meaning, embodying forces like rain, fertility, trade, or migration. When a society faced crisis, these figures often became the focal point of ritual, prophecy, or collective memory. To follow them is to glimpse how a culture interpreted its own fate. In the Indus Valley seals we cannot yet read, but the images suggest a universe teeming with animals and hybrid beings. A horned figure sits cross-legged among tigers, buffalo, and elephants, perhaps an early prototype of a lord of animals, or perhaps a symbol of meditation and balance. For the people of these cities, such an image may have linked civic order with cosmic order. If rivers changed course and fields failed, priests could look to this archetype for guidance or lamented silence. Even without deciphering a single word, the recurring motif of seated power amid wild creatures hints at a worldview where stability emerges from harmonizing opposites, an idea echoed in later South Asian philosophies. In the Orkney Islands, archaeologists have unearthed figurines carved from bone or stone, tiny stylized human forms with almond eyes and exaggerated features. They may have represented ancestors or guardians of households. Local legends speak of the hog boon, mound-dwelling spirits who protect families, but can bring mischief if offended. When people moved away from communal stone houses into scattered farms, these beings remained in story form, watching over barrows and hillocks. In this way, the landscape itself became populated with characters that preserved communal memory after social change. Among the ancestral Puebloans, one finds recurring images of the Kachinas, masked beings representing natural forces, ancestors, or cosmic principles. Even today in Pueblo ceremonies, Kachina dancers embody rain, animals, or moral lessons. In migration stories, these beings often instruct communities to leave one place and journey to another. What outsiders call abandonment may have been experienced as obedience to a sacred timetable delivered through such intermediaries. High in the Andes, Tiwanaku art shows the staff god, a central figure holding rods or plants, flanked by winged attendants. Later cultures in the region carried variations of this deity, connecting him with creation, agricultural cycles, and rulership. When Tiwanaku's urban system broke apart, the icon did not vanish. It spread, adapted, and reappeared in Wari and Inca imagery. This is a powerful clue. Even as a political center dissolves, its symbols can seed future traditions, ensuring continuity disguised as disappearance. Legends of cataclysmic islands also revolve around heroic or villainous figures. In Plato's Atlantis, a lineage of kings descends from the god Poseidon and a mortal woman. Their growing pride and aggression lead Zeus to destroy them. In the Breton legend of Ys, a princess's reckless opening of the sea gates brings inundation. In Southeast Asian stories of sunken cities, it is often a greedy ruler or impious priest who triggers collapse. These characters embody cultural warnings, not simply the gods are angry, but leaders must maintain balance. In Mesoamerica, entire cycles of time are personified. The Aztec gods Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca alternate as creators and destroyers of worlds. Each age ends in a different catastrophe: jaguars, wind, fire, flood. Yet after each destruction, creation resumes. This mythic structure provided a template for interpreting historical crises. When Tula, the Toltec capital, fell, later storytellers cast it as the end of an age, not just a political defeat. Even in Europe, where written chronicles coexist with legend, heroes mark the transition from one cultural layer to another. The Irish Liber Gabler Wren, Book of Invasions, recounts waves of peoples arriving and being displaced, culminating in the ancestors of the Gaels. Earlier inhabitants become the Tuatha De Danann, gods and heroes forced to retreat into the hills, becoming the fairy folk. Here again, disappearance equals transformation. The old powers are not gone but hidden. Symbols act as shorthand for these characters. Spirals, cross-shaped motifs, sun disks, and animal hybrids appear across continents. They are not identical but resonate with similar themes: cycles, directions, life-death renewal, thresholds between worlds. When you see a spiral carved on a stone at Newgrange in Ireland, a labyrinth painted on a Greek vase, and a coil motif in southwest petroglyphs, you're glimpsing variations of a mental map guiding people through time and change. Such symbols are portable. They travel with migrants, survive regime shifts, and even slip into later religions or folk art. Understanding these characters and symbols changes how we read a lost civilization. A deserted plaza is not just an economic ruin, but a stage where stories of gods and heroes once unfolded. A carved animal on a pillar is not mere decoration, but a mnemonic for a festival or migration path. A myth of a sunken city may encode actual flood memories layered with moral drama. When we reconnect these fragments, the vanished world becomes audible again. In our journey, keeping these archetypes in mind will help make sense of the next two mini-films, key plots where entire communities face turning points. Instead of treating them as mysterious disappearances, we can watch them as cultural dramas with protagonists, choices, and consequences. By doing so, we honor not only the stones, but the voices that animated them. Now that the stage is set and the characters have stepped forward, we can follow one of the great vanishings as a miniature drama. In telling it, we'll keep both lenses open, the archaeological record and the inherited stories, so you can sense how a living society experiences crisis, choice, and transformation rather than simply disappearing. One of the most evocative examples is the saga of Chaco Canyon in today's New Mexico. Between the late 800s and the early 1100s CE, a network of great houses, ceremonial plazas, and roads radiated out from this high desert center. Thousands of people gathered there for rituals timed to the sun and moon. Turquoise, seashells, and macaw feathers arrived from hundreds of miles away. For a few centuries, it was the beating heart of the ancestral Puebloan world. Archaeology shows that the system was not static. Tree ring records reveal alternating decades of moisture and drought. Construction booms coincided with good years, then slowed as resources tightened. Pottery styles diversified, suggesting groups from multiple regions living side by side. This was a society balancing on the edge of its environment, trading complexity for vulnerability. From the inside, people would have seen not collapse, but a series of hard seasons, disputes among leaders, and debates about ritual obligations. Among Pueblo descendants today, migration is not framed as catastrophe, but as fulfillment of prophecy. Origin stories speak of clans journeying from one sacred stop to another until instructed to settle. When a place no longer aligned with spiritual or ecological balance, elders read the signs and prepared to move on. This cyclical worldview is crucial. Outsiders describe abandonment. Insiders describe completing a cycle. Imagine, then, a midsummer gathering in Chaco's Great Kiva. Priests mark the solstice. Dancers in Kachina masks embody rain spirits, calling clouds over the parched mesas. Families from distant outposts arrive bearing gifts and grievances. Whispers spread about failing crops, disputes over leadership, omens in the sky. Some advocate building still larger ceremonial houses to restore order. Others argue the time has come to disperse. Over months and years, decisions accumulate. Fewer pilgrims, fewer repairs, more movement toward new homes in the Rio Grande Valley or the Hopi Mesas. To later archaeologists, it looks like a sudden emptying. To participants, it was a series of departures, guided by tradition as much as necessity. This same pattern of conflict, choice, and consequence appears in Tiwanaku around Lake Titicaca. At its height around 800 to 1000 CE, the city controlled raised field agriculture and regional trade networks across the high Andes. Its monumental stones and sun-aligned gates spoke of cosmic order. But ice core and lake sediment data show prolonged drought beginning in the 11th century. Crops failed, canals silted. As stress mounted, regional groups reasserted autonomy. By the time Europeans first heard of the site centuries later, it was a place of awe and myth, built by giants or frozen by the gods. Local Aymara traditions still speak of sacred centers, turned to stone, after taboo breaking or divine withdrawal. Such metaphors preserve both the trauma of leaving and the dignity of purpose. A people may lose a capital but keep its cosmology, transplanting rituals to new villages. Thus Tiwanaku did not vanish so much as transform into a sacred memory anchoring later Andean cultures, including the Inca. Another case, often told as a moral parable, is the city of Cahokia near today's St. Louis. In the 11th and 12th centuries, it was the largest urban center north of Mexico, with massive earthen mounds and a population perhaps exceeding many European cities of the time. Its woodhenge of post circles tracked solstices. Its plazas hosted vast gatherings. By the 1300s, population declined sharply. Drought, resource depletion, internal tensions, and shifting trade likely all played roles. Yet Mississippian iconography spread widely afterward, influencing distant communities. The collapse became a diaspora of ideas. These examples show how a dramatic headline, "The city that vanished overnight," compresses decades of decisions, migrations, and reinterpretations. In each case, we can reconstruct a story arc: conflict, environmental stress, political factionalism, spiritual doubt, choice, build bigger monuments, change leadership, relocate, or disperse. Consequence, urban center empties, descendants carry practices elsewhere. Legends later frame it as sudden doom or sacred withdrawal. Understanding that arc allows us to approach the next set of vanishings, those wrapped in alternative versions and regional differences, with more nuance. It also invites reflection on our own societies. We, too, live within complex systems tied to climate, trade, and belief. Our myths of apocalypse or renewal may one day be how descendants interpret our choices. As you listen, hold in mind the dancers, priests, farmers, and children within these sites. Their lives were not a mystery but a rhythm. When the rhythm changed, so did their homes. The stones we see today are not evidence of failure, but of life's movement, a pulse captured in architecture and myth. Every legend of a vanished world has more than one telling. What sounds like a single mystery from a distance is often a tangle of overlapping stories, each shaped by geography, language, and the viewpoint of those who tell it. In this section, we move through some of the most famous alternative versions of disappearance, episodes where the same site or event is explained in several ways, depending on who speaks. Take the case of the Maya lowlands. For decades, the dominant image was of sudden collapse around 800 to 900 CE, with once great cities like Tikal, Copan, and Palenque abandoned to the jungle. This image came from early explorers who stumbled upon vine-covered temples and assumed an overnight catastrophe. Yet archaeology over the last half-century shows a patchwork of outcomes. Some centers declined while others thrived. Warfare intensified in some regions, trade shifted in others, drought cycles added stress, and population movements created new hubs. To modern Maya communities, these sites are not lost at all but part of a continuous sacred geography. In their stories, ancestors withdrew when the time was right, not because of random disaster. One collapse, many interpretations. A similar multiplicity surrounds Great Zimbabwe in southern Africa. When European settlers first encountered its towering stone enclosures in the 19th century, they refused to believe local Shona peoples could have built them. Theories sprang up about Phoenicians, Arabs, or a vanished white race. Only later did archaeology and oral history firmly re-establish Great Zimbabwe as a product of African ingenuity and long-distance trade. For Shona oral tradition, the site was never lost. It remained a locus of spiritual power connected to ancestors. For colonial writers, calling it mysterious ruins served political ends. Same stones, radically different narratives. Then there's Angkor, the vast Khmer capital in today's Cambodia. Its stone temples, especially Angkor Wat, survived while the wooden city around them vanished. French explorers in the 19th century romanticized it as a lost city swallowed by jungle. In reality, Angkor was never forgotten by local Buddhists, who continued to worship at its shrines. The center shifted gradually as rivers changed course and political power moved. Legends arose of a hidden city of the Naga princess, of kings who broke sacred pacts with water spirits. Even today, Cambodian folktales intertwine mythic snakes with explanations for canals and moats. Outsiders see disappearance, insiders see metamorphosis. In the Andes, the fortress of Vilcabamba, last refuge of the Inca resistance against Spanish conquest, also carries two faces. For European chroniclers, it was a jungle hideout, finally crushed. For Quechua oral history, it was a sacred retreat, chosen and left according to omens, its abandonment part of a spiritual continuity rather than defeat. When explorers searched for the lost city of the Inca, they projected a single dramatic ending. In truth, there were several royal refuges, each with its own timeline and legend. Even Atlantis, the archetype of vanished civilizations, has regional variants. Beyond Plato's text, you find echoes in Berber myths of a sunken island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in Celtic tales of drowned lands like Lyonesse, in Caribbean stories of islands swallowed by waves. Each culture fits the template to its own coastline and history. Some versions are cautionary tales about hubris, others about inevitable cycles, still others about heroic survivors who seed new societies. Why do these alternative versions matter? Because they reveal that disappearance is a lens, not a fact. The same demographic shift can be told as tragedy, migration, punishment, or renewal. The same ruins can be framed as proof of alien visitors or of ancestor skill. By comparing versions, you see the values of each culture reflected back. Who is blamed? Who is honored? Whether leaving is shameful or sacred. Modern science has its own alternative versions as data accumulate. Early aerial photos of the Amazon suggested empty rainforest punctuated by isolated tribes. LiDAR and soil analysis now reveal a mosaic of ancient earthworks, causeways, and villages, evidence of large, organized societies that European diseases and conquest later decimated. The mystery was not their sudden disappearance, but our failure to see the traces beneath the canopy. You can watch this reframing happen in real time with Rapa Nui, Easter Island. For decades, the textbook story was ecocide. The islanders chopped down all the trees, toppled their own statues, and collapsed. Recent interdisciplinary studies show a different picture: sustainable gardening techniques, cooperative statue building, and demographic decline only after European contact and slavery raids. Local oral histories emphasize voyaging ancestors and spiritual guardians, not self-destruction. The same island, Two opposing narratives, cautionary fable or case study of resilience under colonial shock. This pattern of competing stories also appears in the smaller, less famous sites. On the Orkney Islands, one local legend attributes the emptying of stone villages to a giant's curse, another to a sudden plague, another to people leaving voluntarily for better lands. In the Mississippi Valley, some Native American traditions frame mound builder centers as ceremonial gathering places rather than permanent cities, making abandonment less mysterious. In each instance, regional differences show that vanishing overnight is often a mirage of outsider perspective. Recognizing these multiple versions changes how you, the listener, inhabit the rest of our journey. It frees you from expecting a single smoking gun behind each disappearance. It also brings humility. Our own society's future may be told in ways we cannot control, as migration, collapse, or renewal, depending on who speaks. Myths are not lies but narrative choices, and archaeology is not a final verdict, but an evolving conversation. In the next parts we'll shift from these dramatic episodes to the deeper layers of symbols, animals, numbers, celestial alignments that thread through all these vanished worlds. Those patterns will show how meaning persisted even when cities did not. Behind every ruin and legend lies a language of symbols. Animals carved on lintels, numbers embedded in staircases, constellations mirrored in temple layouts. These were not ornamental flourishes. They were living mnemonics, ways to encode calendars, ethics, and relationships with the natural world. When a civilization vanished, these symbols often proved more durable than walls, surviving as folk motifs, rituals, or place names long after the original society dissolved. Start with animals. Across continents, vanished cultures used them as stand-ins for cosmic forces. In Chaco Canyon, macaw feathers and turkeys were not just trade items, but ritual markers of distant connections. In Tiwanaku, pumas and condors flanked the staff god, embodying earth and sky. Among the Maya, jaguars prowl temple reliefs as lords of the underworld, while in Orkney's Neolithic art, stylized seabirds evoke migration and seasonal return. These creatures created a mental map linking the everyday, hunting, herding, fishing, with cycles of fertility, rain, and direction. When people moved on, these emblems moved with them, painted on pottery or stitched into textiles, allowing memory to travel. Numbers carried similar weight. 4 for the cardinal directions, 5 for the center plus 4 quarters, 9 for layers of the underworld, 13 for lunar cycles. We see these numbers repeated in steps, terraces, pillars, and offerings. The pattern is clear even when inscriptions are lost. A step pyramid with 9 levels at a site in one region echoes a 9-layered underworld myth in another. This was a silent code. As long as you built or performed in these numbers, you were aligned with the cosmos. When drought or invasion disrupted life, adherence to these numeric rhythms could be intensified or reinterpreted, a way to make sense of change. Objects, too, carried layered meaning. Shell trumpets in the Andes called communities together and invoked oceanic origins at a high-altitude lake. Turquoise beads in the southwest linked earth and sky. In Orkney, carved stone balls with multiple knobs, still a mystery to archaeologists, may have been ritual counters, weapons, or cosmological models. Even if their exact use fades, their form persists in later art, like a fossil of an idea. This is how a lost culture continues to speak, through shape and pattern rather than text. Celestial alignments formed the grandest of these symbols. Solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, all tracked in stone. At Chaco, windows framed the rising sun at the solstice. At Tiwanaku, the gateway of the sun casts a lattice of shadows, marking calendrical events. In the British Isles, passage tombs align with midwinter sunrise. These orientations are not mere astronomy, but woven into ritual life, agricultural planning, and political legitimacy. A ruler who could predict the heavens could claim to maintain cosmic order. When the sky pattern changed, or a drought broke the link between ritual and harvest, legitimacy wavered. Myths of gods withdrawing or cities turning to stone are poetic ways of expressing a broken contract between sky and society. Symbols also traveled. The spiral, for example, appears in Neolithic Europe, the American Southwest, Polynesia, and beyond. Sometimes it marks water, sometimes journey, sometimes life force, but always movement through time and space. The cross and circle motif, 4 directions around a center, emerges in mound builder art, Andean textiles, and Old World carvings. Such universals speak to shared human intuitions about orientation and cycles. They also made it easier for migrating groups to carry a portable cosmology, recognizable even if languages changed. Even colors were symbolic. Red ochre for life and blood, white shells for purity and ancestors, black for the underworld or fertile soil. At vanished sites we find these pigments still clinging to walls or buried in caches. When people moved, they brought the color code into new ceremonies. Long after a capital city is abandoned, you may still see its palette in the embroidery of descendants. Modern science now detects symbols at scales invisible before. LiDAR reveals geometric earthworks in the Amazon shaped like animals and constellations. Satellite imagery picks up vast desert drawings aligning with solstices. These findings show that what seemed like isolated villages were parts of symbolic landscapes stretching for miles. In other words, the culture's memory was written on the land itself. When inhabitants left, the text remained until overgrown, then rediscovered centuries later as a mystery. Understanding the symbolic layer shifts how you hear the phrase, vanished overnight. Even if buildings crumble, symbols persist like seeds. They sprout in new places, hybridize with other traditions, and sometimes reemerge in surprising forms: a folk dance, a pattern on pottery, a festival date. This is why myths endure. They are not just stories, but carriers of codes, ensuring that even when a civilization appears to disappear, its worldview remains latent. In the next part, we'll explore how these echoes surface in today's languages, holidays, pop culture, and digital worlds, showing that vanished civilizations never truly leave. They migrate into our own imagination. When we speak of vanished civilizations, we tend to picture sealed tombs and overgrown cities. Yet their afterlife is not confined to ruins. It breathes in our languages, our calendars, our architecture, even in the games we play and the films we watch. This echoing presence is subtle but powerful, a proof that disappearance is rarely total. Start with language. Place names are some of the most resilient cultural fossils. Across the Americas you find rivers, mountains, and towns carrying indigenous names whose original meanings are now obscure to most residents. Mississippi, for example, derives from an Ojibwe word for great river. Cahokia, now a mound site, was also a clan name remembered by later peoples. In Europe, Celtic roots persist in hill names and river names long after Romanization. Each time you say them, you unconsciously speak a syllable of a vanished world. The same is true of words for time. Our 7-day week, planetary names, and zodiac signs are inheritances from Mesopotamian and Greco-Roman cosmologies. Festivals such as solstice fires in Scandinavia, May Day dances in Britain, or harvest offerings in the Andes echo ritual calendars older than written records. Even when converted into new religions, the timing and gestures carry memory. A modern holiday might celebrate a saint, but the date may mark an equinox once observed by farmers of a forgotten culture. Architecture offers another field of echoes. The stepped form of ziggurats reappears in Mesoamerican pyramids, which in turn influenced neoclassical architects designing museums and courthouses. Urban grids pioneered in the Indus Valley, and Roman camps still shape modern city planning. When you walk down a straight avenue aligned with a sunset, you're part of a pattern thousands of years old. These continuities are so normalized that we stop seeing them, yet they bind us to the vanished. In popular culture, the echoes become overt. Movies, novels, and video games routinely borrow motifs from lost civilizations, hidden temples, sunken islands, mysterious glyphs. Atlantis is reimagined as everything from a utopia to an alien outpost. Maya calendars become apocalyptic countdowns and thrillers. Even fantasy worlds, from Tolkien's Numenor to contemporary streaming series, mirror the Atlantis template. A proud society undone by hubris, its ruins inspiring quests. These fictional worlds feed on our fascination with disappearance, but they also keep real cultures in public imagination, albeit in distorted form. Sometimes the echo is not thematic but direct collaboration. Descendant communities work with archaeologists to revive ancient practices. In the American Southwest, traditional Pueblo farmers have reintroduced ancestral varieties of maize and beans, showing resilience under drought conditions. In the Andes, raised field agriculture once thought lost has been reconstructed with local farmers, improving yields and water management. In these cases, the past is not a museum but a toolkit. Digital technology amplifies the afterlife of vanished civilizations. LiDAR, satellite imagery, and 3D scanning make it possible to map and share sites in unprecedented detail. Virtual reconstructions let you walk through Angkor or Tiwanaku online. Indigenous storytellers use social media to teach original names and myths of places long misrepresented. In effect, cultures once labeled lost gain new platforms to speak for themselves. Even our metaphors show how deeply these echoes shape us. In business, people warn of Atlantis projects that sink under their own weight. In politics, journalists describe Rome before the fall. In personal life, we speak of burning bridges, crossing thresholds, returning to our roots. These are not random phrases. They are traces of the mythic frameworks through which humans have always interpreted change, continuity, and loss. The persistence of symbols also means that myths travel into new contexts. The spiral motif of migration appears in modern art, logos, and tattoos. The four directions cross becomes a compass rose on maps and smartphone apps. Solstice festivals evolve into music gatherings at ancient sites. These appropriations are sometimes superficial, but they also testify to the magnetic pull of old patterns. People sense meaning even if they no longer know the original story. This echoing can be double-edged. On one side, it revives awareness and respect. On the other, it risks erasing the living descendants behind the ruins, turning complex histories into exotic backdrops. That is why many indigenous scholars emphasize the phrase ancestral sites rather than lost civilizations, framing continuity instead of disappearance. It's a reminder that myths are not only heritage but also identity. Seen in this light, our fascination with vanished worlds becomes less about nostalgia and more about mirror gazing. We project onto Atlantis or Cahokia our hopes and fears about climate change, inequality, or technological overreach. We ask, what if our society disappeared overnight? And we rehearse answers through fiction, festivals, and research. By studying their symbols and stories, we prepare for our own uncertainties. The next part of our journey will bring this reflection into sharper focus. We will step back from myths and look at how science, anthropology, climatology, and psychology interprets disappearance. Where do scholarly findings confirm tradition, and where do they challenge it? How does our own need for narrative shape what we call collapse? These questions help us see that vanished civilizations are not just about the past, but about how we think, remember, and imagine our collective future. At this point, you've walked through myths, symbols, and echoes. Now it's time to step into the lab and field trenches, where archaeologists, anthropologists, and climate scientists work. Their findings do not replace legend, they complement it. Together, they show how societies change and why the idea of vanishing overnight persists even when evidence suggests gradual processes. Archaeology begins with the tangible: walls, tools, bones, pollen, isotopes. Radiocarbon dating anchors artifacts in time. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, maps drought cycles. Stable isotopes in human teeth trace where a person grew up, revealing migration. Soil cores hold microscopic pollen grains that reconstruct ancient landscapes. Each technique is like a new sense added to our perception of the past. These methods often confirm parts of oral tradition. For example, Aboriginal stories of rising seas match maps of submerged coastlines after the Ice Age. Pacific Islanders' genealogies of voyaging align with DNA evidence of settlement patterns. Pueblo migration narratives find echoes in pottery chemical signatures, showing movement of clay and pigment sources. Such convergences give weight to legends long dismissed as fantasy. Sometimes science challenges traditional or popular narratives. The echo side story of Rapa Nui, as we noted, has been revised by archaeobotanical and skeletal analysis showing sustainable gardening and outside shocks. The mysterious disappearance of the Maya becomes a mosaic of regionally specific outcomes when climate models and epigraphic decipherment are combined. Even the collapse of the Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean, once cast as sudden and total, is now seen as a complex interplay of trade disruption, migration, and climate stress, with some areas thriving after others fell. Psychology adds another layer. Humans have a bias for dramatic events. We remember the day a volcano erupted, not the decades of minor tremors. We like stories with moral arcs. A city falls because its leaders were arrogant, not because of a slow decline in rainfall. This bias shapes both oral tradition and modern media coverage of archaeology. Lost City Discovered makes a better headline than gradual urban decentralization documented. Another reason Vanished Overnight endures is that ruins genuinely feel abrupt. You step into a deserted room with pottery still on the floor, and your brain leaps to everyone fled suddenly. But those objects could have been placed there months or years before final departure, or reused by squatters later. Archaeologists call this the Pompeii premise, assuming a snapshot in time when the record is actually palimpsest. Careful stratigraphy and dating help avoid this illusion. Climate science has transformed our understanding of past societies. Ice cores, lake sediments, and speleothems, cave formations, preserve records of rainfall, temperature, and volcanic eruptions. Correlating these with settlement patterns shows how even advanced systems were vulnerable to environmental shifts. Yet vulnerability is not destiny. Some communities adapted, diversified, or moved. Others intensified ritual or hierarchy in ways that backfired. Recognizing this variability helps dismantle simplistic rise and fall models. Anthropology also shows that collapse can be a culturally relative term. For an empire losing control of distant provinces, the center may see decline. For local communities regaining autonomy, the same event may feel like liberation. This perspective explains why some oral traditions frame abandonment as sacred withdrawal rather than disaster. It also offers a humbling lens on our own time. Our measures of success and failure may not match how future generations interpret our choices. Technology is giving a second life to vanished worlds. Remote sensing reveals landscapes too vast to excavate by hand. Ancient DNA reconstructs population movements. Isotope geochemistry traces trade networks across continents. These data allow us to build richer, more human pictures. Not just elites and monuments, but farmers, traders, children. The more complete the picture, the less mysterious disappearance becomes, and the more it looks like transformation. This scientific view does not drain myth of meaning. On the contrary, it shows how myths preserved long-term memory in symbolic form. A flood story may encode a sea level rise. A tale of a mountain spirit may mark an earthquake zone. A prophecy of migration may reflect real cycles of soil exhaustion and renewal. Even when details diverge, the pattern remains. Myth is a cultural hard drive storing lessons in narrative code. Understanding both lenses also protects against romanticizing. Some lost civilization tropes have been used to deny the achievements of indigenous peoples or to attribute their works to outsiders or aliens. Science, when practiced with respect, can restore credit to the real builders and highlight continuity with living descendants. Collaboration with local communities is increasingly standard in archaeology, shifting the story from "we discovered" to "we're learning together." As you listen to these findings, notice how they mirror your own experience of memory. You don't recall every mundane moment. You remember turning points, crises, and rituals. Civilizations do the same through myth. Science fills in the everyday context around those turning points. Together they give a fuller picture than either alone. In the next and final part of our journey, we will bring all these threads together, myth, symbol, echo, and science, to ask what these vanished civilizations teach us about resilience, identity, and the impermanence of our own world. You've traveled across deserts, islands, mountains, and forests. You've met cultures who built on a grand scale and then moved on. Storytellers who turned migration into myth. Archaeologists and elders who pieced together what happened. As we close this journey, The ruins you imagined at the start should now look different. They are not empty shells of mystery, but traces of decisions, relationships, and dreams. Lives as complex and fragile as our own. The first lesson these vanished civilizations offer is that disappearance is rarely destruction. It is usually transformation. People relocate, merge, adapt, reinvent. Languages shift, rituals change shape, but core ideas persist. This is why you can still taste Inca crops on Andean terraces, hear Polynesian navigation chants in modern canoe voyages, and see Neolithic spirals in digital logos. Cultures are not candles blown out. They are fires carried forward. The second lesson is humility. Many of the societies you've heard about believe their order to be permanent, sanctioned by gods or cosmic cycles. Yet rivers moved, climate shifted, trade faltered, or leadership failed. Complex systems proved vulnerable. The same is true of ours. Our cities, supply chains, and digital networks feel stable, but they too depend on delicate balances. Myths of Atlantis or YS endure because they dramatize a universal anxiety, losing what we've built overnight. By studying how past peoples adapted or faltered, we gain perspective on our own choices. Third, these stories teach respect for memory. Oral traditions, once dismissed as superstition, often preserve accurate, environmental knowledge across millennia. Symbols carved on stones are not mere art, but codes of survival, migration, and cosmic orientation. Listening to descendant communities and collaborating in research enriches the narrative. It turns lost civilizations back into ancestral civilizations with living heirs. Fourth, they remind us that myth and science are not enemies. One speaks in metaphor, the other in measurement, but both arise from the same human impulse to find meaning in change. A flood is a hydrological event. It is also a story about renewal and humility before nature. A migration is a demographic pattern. It is also a journey toward destiny. Understanding this dual language makes our view of history more nuanced and our own myths more conscious. Finally, there is inspiration. The architectures of Chaco, Tiwanaku, Angkor, or Great Zimbabwe were not only feats of engineering but of imagination, visions of how humans could live together and align with sky, earth, and water. Even after their centers were abandoned, their ideas seeded future societies. When you stand before a mound, a temple, or a carved stone, you're looking at a message sent across time. We were here. We believed. We built. We changed. In our age of fast headlines and short attention spans, long stories like these act as a corrective. They stretch your sense of time, showing civilizations as living organisms rather than cautionary fables. They invite you to ask, what of our own world will endure? Which of our symbols will future people still recognize? What myths will they tell about us? Perhaps one day, centuries from now, someone will walk among the remains of our cities, reading our graffiti, decoding our data traces, and weaving their own legends of rise and change. If they do, may they find evidence not only of our technologies, but of our empathy, creativity, and willingness to learn from those who came before. And that is why these legends matter now. They are not ghost stories. They are mirrors. They show that human beings have always faced uncertainty, have always responded with ritual and reason, and have always carried their knowledge forward in some form. No culture truly vanishes overnight if its stories continue to be told. As you close your eyes and think of the silent plazas, the carved spirals, the flooded islands, hold them not as warnings of doom but as invitations. Invitations to remember that everything built is part of a cycle, that what seems permanent is a chapter, not the whole book, and that the myths we tell today shape how our descendants will read us tomorrow. This is the enduring gift of the vanished civilizations. A long view of human resilience and imagination, a reminder that even in disappearance, there is continuity, and in endings, the seeds of beginnings.